Welcome to the next edition of the Legislative Lens podcast presented by the Ventura County Coastal Association of Realtors. My name is Rob Leatherwood. I am the Government Affairs Director and your host. And joining us today is the CEO, the El Jefe of the Housing Authority of San Buenaventura, Mr. Jeff Lambert. Thanks for being with us, Jeff.
Hey, Rob. Happy to be here.
Thank you, sir. I know you got a lot of irons in the fire, so appreciate you making some time. So as I've been here over the last 18 months or so here in Ventura County, I've heard the stories of the work you did when you were at the city of Ventura as the community development director there, the work you're currently doing with the housing authority. And I just can't find anyone that has a negative thing to say about you. You are revered in our community. So I appreciate all the work you've done. But let's get into that. Let's talk a little bit about your history and your background and how you got to Ventura County.
Sure, and I promise I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but I like to tell people I was born in a small town in Maine, only because I'm really connected to this Ventura as a small town. It's a big small town, but it's still a small town.
For sure.
Everybody knows everybody in this town, and so that is what I like about this town. I've been in Ventura for about 15 years, and various roles. As you said, the largest role I had was as a community development director for the city of Ventura. I was also in Oxnard for about a year and a half. I worked for the Community Foundation for a few years.
What did you do in Oxnard?
I was the community development director in Oxnard.
Okay.
There for about a year and a half, a little over a year and a half.
I'm sensing a recurring theme.
And then I was the chief operating officer at the Community Foundation, the Ventura County Community Foundation, for about 3 years, and then landed at the Housing Authority in the summer of 2023.
Very good. Well, you've got all kinds of connections and all kinds of experience here in Ventura County. I think, if I remember correctly, you were in Ventura in 2017 when the Thomas fire happened, were you not?
I was.
What describe to us a little bit what that experience was like and what you learned from that?
Well, it's interesting. I always start with the fact that fire happened during a city council meeting, during the changing of the guard. It was when then Mayor Neil Andrews was actually literally giving his acceptance speech. He had just been sworn in as mayor when the entire city council audience was called away. The whole executive team was left to set up the emergency operations center.
Wow.
So it was a pretty dramatic night. We had council members that were evacuated from where they lived. We set up a 24-hour recovery system at the police and fire headquarters, and then went to work. We obviously weren't fighting fires, but the way these fires work is the fire department and all the fire departments that come in to help us during that period of time, and there were thousands of firefighters from all over the state and the western part of the United States. But from my perspective, we're talking about recovery from the day one, because we knew it was going to be a pretty bad impact, and we had over 500 homes lost in the city of Ventura. And so we needed to start thinking about how do we understand the nature and the amount of the impact? How do we be able to assess how many homes were lost, how many were totally lost, how many were impacted? We sort of had to put those gears in place fast, because our goal, and I say this with the fire chief all the time, he had the job of fighting the fire, but when the fire's over, it's my job to help rebuild. And that's the job of the community development director. So we were thinking about how do we put in place the process about rebuilding when people want to come in and rebuild, because people were coming in within days of the fire wanting to know what the process was to rebuild their house.
What kind of concerns did you and your team have about, you're looking at, what is this recovery going to look like? What do we need to do, getting everything in place, everybody in place? What sorts of potential problems did you see that hey, we better get ahead of this. We better have a protocol for this?
Well, we were lucky in a way that there was a significant Northern California fire just before, weeks before the Thomas fire. And so literally that city manager came down and spent a week with us right after the fire. And that was really invaluable to us to understand what was next. But we really had to understand what were the rules for rebuilding? And I think one of the things we struggled with a lot is these homeowners wanted to they saw their foundation still in place. Right. So they were hoping they could just rebuild their house on top of the foundation, but they didn't understand that the fire had made that foundation no longer safe.
Sure.
But they saw it there, and we had to convince them that had to go. And the good thing is we had a great partnership with the state. The state did all the debris removal. So when the state was done removing debris, homeowners had a sort of a clean slate to start from.
Just like a naked pad.
And that was helpful. But giving the homeowners the confidence that, that we're here from the government, we're here to help you clean your site. Yeah. We had a lot of resistance. It took us a while to get homeowners to understand that actually was beneficial to them. And most of the time they have a small rider on their insurance that pays for debris removal. It was never going to be enough to cover the costs. And so they had to give that up in order to get the state to come in, but they gave up, let's just say, $10,000, and it costs $80,000 to clear their site. So it was a good deal for all of those homeowners. But we had to start gathering documents to give them, here's all the documents we have on your property, so you can start thinking about how to rebuild if that's something you want.
Well, that was going to be my next question, Jeff, was, this is a process of developing relationships, establishing trust. How do you establish trust and build relationships with people in a sort of traumatic situation like that where, maybe they're a little more guarded, maybe they're very anxious about what does their family look like a year from now? What is their, how do you build that trust?
And for me, it seems simple, but it really was, showing up. We had groups of neighbors that were meeting at restaurants because they had no place to live or they were living in temporary quarters and they were trying to gather themselves together to share information. So I would just show up at those restaurants and just be a face of the city and give them some hope that we had a process in place and listen to them about how our rebuild process would best help them. We also these were hillside homes, and views are pretty critical. Yep. And we had homes that we don't have a view protection ordinance in the city of Ventura. So how do we allow some flexible rebuilding, but respecting people's homes? So one of the things we in our rebuild ordinance that we did is we put rules in place, but we allowed people to exceed the rules under my discretion, which was pretty risky for me to take on. What do you mean
exceed the rules? Can you give me an example?
Yeah, so the rules put an envelope in place that said you could rebuild your house exactly in the same envelope it was before, or under the current zoning if it happened to allow a little bit higher envelope. But if you wanted to do something more than that, I could approve it under my authority as long as I could make a determination that they weren't unreasonably impacting the neighbor's views. Sure. And so I did a lot of site inspections to make sure that, and to give people the flexibility, because if somebody went through that kind of trauma of losing everything they owned, the least we can do is help them get something better from a house perspective back. And so that we spent a lot of time being really careful about helping people get what they wanted back. If they couldn't get all their possessions back, maybe they got that dream house, or maybe they got that remodel that they wish they would have had. So they got something out of it that made it worthwhile to go through the process. And it's daunting. Most people don't go through a city permit process.
Right.
And so when we had 500 people having to go through it at one time, it took a lot of effort. We had a great partnership with local architects and contractors. They helped us craft the regulations so that they made sense and they were buildable. I'm not a contractor or an architect. If I create regulations, I don't know if it's buildable. So they kind of ground truth with us to make sure that what we were putting in place on paper was actually something that somebody could deliver and build.
So I have heard stories about people who wanted to rebuild their home exactly how it was. And when it was built, of course, it was in code in 1965 or whatever it was. But in 2017, maybe parts of that design were not in code anymore. How do you solve those sorts of nuances and complications?
Yeah, so they had to comply with current building codes. That was the most important part. We couldn't vary from that. And so some of these homes were built in the 80s. The codes change every 3 years. So the codes that apply today, the building codes, have changed a dozen times since they built their house. And that was a hard part, is they couldn't build it exactly the way it was because the codes required different standards. And so that was a nuance. But if they had a good architect, and there was several good architects that did a lot of different properties all at the same time, and they became really knowledgeable, and they became the expert bridge between what the city required. And we also encouraged residents, if they could, given their circumstances, if they could come in with their architect and go through the plan check process with them. And so we could not just be talking to their third party sort of person, but to them directly, and help them understand what we were doing. That helps.
Some things getting lost in translation.
Totally. And they actually saw that we were helping. And I tell people a lot, I know I personally hug more strangers in those first year than anything. And one of the things that we realized pretty quickly is we had a lot of people in a lot of pain coming to City Hall pretty regularly. And so the other component of that is making sure our staff that were on the front lines got some breaks from that. Because if you're dealing with these folks with terrible trauma, half a day of that and you're pretty wasted.
It's emotionally exhausting.
It really is.
Yes.
And so we had to make sure we rotated staff so that it wasn't just one person with that responsibility. We also created sort of a separate, basically a separate permit line. If you were a Thomas Fire rebuild, you went to this line, not this line.
Right.
So you didn't get stuck in the rest of the process, and that made a huge difference. And we were personal, and we ended up creating lawn signs when somebody got their permit.
That's cool.
We took a picture of them with their plans, and then we gave them a lawn sign that they could put in their line that says, "I got a permit," and that just gave people a lot of hope that they were moving forward. We had one couple who went from losing their home to moving into their new home within 12 months. And that was unheard of.
That's incredible.
But they had just done a major remodel. They had very fresh set of building plans that were already compliant with the building code. So it was a very unique circumstance, but it gave a lot of hope to everybody else to see somebody move into their home so quickly. And then it just took off from there.
Wow. Well, congrats and bravo on a job well done.
Yeah.
Of course, our neighbors to the south in Camarillo are experiencing a lot of this right now with the mountain fire. What, if anything, are you hearing about the recovery process out there, and what words of encouragement can you give to Camarillo residents?
Yeah, it's another tragedy, and I feel their pain, if nothing else. I know what they're going through, and I think it's a matter of just really being clear out of the gate that you intend to help people rebuild, and making sure that's a priority, and then giving them the tools to rebuild as quickly as possible, having the resources set aside to make sure that they have sort of their own path to that process. And I think building in some flexibility, because very few people built the house back exactly the way they had it before. And you want to give them some flexibility to do that, so that they can begin to recover something from this tragedy.
As our neighbors in Camarillo go through this, or rewinding back to your experience in 2017 with the Thomas Fire, what role do nonprofit and community organizations play in this? Because it's a big recovery effort, whether, and it's all hands on deck, community wide. Our folks at the government are doing what they do, trying to get funding and move the process along. What role do community and social organizations play in these types of recoveries?
Well, I mean, having the time at the Community Foundation, I was there after the Thomas Fire, but they played a big role in the Thomas Fire, and became, I think, unfortunately, they became experts in disaster recovery. And they've done it again with the Camarillo Fire, with the Mountain Fire. They've set up a fund where, and it's often people want to give, but they don't know who to give to that they can trust. And so having it go to the Community Foundation, because I know in this case, the Community Foundation set up funds for the Thomas Fire, and I suspect for Mountain Fire, without charging the normal fees they charge on funds. Right. They did that. So they basically absorbed all the administrative costs within their administrative budget, meaning that those dollars go directly to people in need. It gives people who want to support the effort a place to go where they know the money's going to really make a difference. And I think that's the best kind of guidance, is because there's always a lot of pop-ups. And one of the things that we were working on at the Community Foundation when I was there is just trying to set in place who are the organizations that you can rely on, that can pop up quickly and are reliable, sustainable organizations, and let's support them because they have the ongoing experience, and then support pop-ups if there are gaps in the response that those organizations are not. And a good example is if you need childcare. Families need childcare. You don't need to create a pop-up childcare facility. You have Boys and Girls Clubs, and you have the YMCA, and you have organizations already in town to do that work. Let's support them, give them the wherewithal to turn on a dime and expand their capacity post a disaster, rather than bringing in some new out-of-town childcare facility provider. But then if there's some other gap that's not there, then the locally sort of nonprofits can fill those gaps and do pop-ups.
Well, and I would imagine each community is a little different.
Yep.
And each disaster is a little different.
Yep.
During the Thomas Fire, the Ventura County Coastal Association of Realtors applied to California Association of Realtors and National Association of Realtors, and we're able to bring over $500,000 in relief to people who were affected by the fire.
Yeah.
I'm working on the same process right now for the Mountain Fire in Camarillo. So, whether it's like housing, childcare, groceries, there are resources available in Ventura County.
Yeah.
And, you can go to the city of Camarillo or the Community Foundation at our website, vcrealtors.com. There's a lot of information. We're trying to do all we can to support the recovery.
Yeah. Yeah, and the good thing about Ventura is we're the right size. And one of the things I think I've seen in the 15 years I've been in town is we're the size of a region where we know each other. I can call the county CEO's office and probably get this about directly if I need to. It's not like the people that are that far away. We have really strong relationships. And
it's a big, small town.
It's a big, small town.
Yeah.
And I could tell you, one of our police chief in Ventura at the time of the fire said it very well. You can't make friends during a disaster. You need to have them in advance of a disaster, because that if you spend time building those relationships, when something happens, you already have the people to reach out.
You're a step ahead.
Yeah,
several steps ahead.
Yes,
really,
exactly. Yeah.
Well, shifting gears a little bit.
Sure.
Now you are at the Housing Authority, running the show there.
Yep.
You've been there about 15 months?
Yes.
About 15 months?
August of 23. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, wow. That was just a guess. I'm glad I nailed it.
Yep. Good job.
So what has your experience been so far? What kind of challenges have you uncovered? And let's just start with kind of how it's going so far.
It's been a great experience. I think it's the right fit for me to be at the Housing Authority at this time. Not only did we just hit our 75th anniversary as an agency, so we've been around since 1949, which is pretty big deal. But we've over the last 10 years really shifted from a sort of an old school public housing agency where we are completely reliant on the federal government and on housing and urban development funding to operate sort of old school public housing. We're a sort of a modern, forward-thinking nonprofit developer of affordable housing now, and we've made that switch probably about 10 years ago, and we've done several projects. And I think one of the most exciting things for me is that I've been involved in homelessness the entire time I've been in this community, and now the Housing Authority several years decided to sort of, I would say, dip our toe into the homelessness solution by setting aside units in our new development for people experiencing homelessness. And we have about 50 or so units across our portfolio for people that are either currently homeless or people that are at risk of being homeless that are now living in our properties. But we made the decision, it was made before I got there, but we closed escrow during my time to buy a hotel,
Very cool.
the La Quinta Hotel, and convert it to 134 units of permanent supportive housing for those experiencing homelessness. And it is a big deal. And it's a complicated, I would say, gnarly process.
Affordable housing always is.
It always is. And every project is different. Every project is complicated. Every project requires 10 or so different sources of funding. This is nothing. This is not unlike any of those. But the direct impact and immediate impact we have on people already, and we're not even done the first phase of renovation on that building, is really exciting. And so for me, that's been a really great opportunity to make that kind of a difference. And we have families that are hardworking families too. Most of the people living at La Quinta are single folks who have been experiencing homelessness, but we have over 1,100 units across our portfolio. Half of them or so are seniors. The rest are families.
Having spent so much time in the housing space and working directly on homelessness issues, how important is it, or how much of a difference does it make to keep someone from becoming homeless as opposed to pulling someone off the street after they've crossed that line?
Oh, it's night and day. If somebody's still housed and you can keep them housed, there's a Ventura County homeless prevention organization that their job is to raise money, and they help people who are one paycheck away from being homeless. They pay rent for them for 1 month, and that's what they needed to overcome some one-time incident. That's $1,000 or $1,500 or $2,000 to spend to keep somebody housed. If they were evicted and on the street, you'd be chasing them and trying to find them places. And if you ever were able to house them, it could cost you tens of thousands of dollars to get them into housing. So it's a much better a deal. And it's obviously it's better from a human being perspective to help somebody stay housed. But from the society perspective, it makes a much bigger difference.
Well, I mean, we know that when people become homeless, when they lose their housing, it's not uncommon for someone to have a latent, like emotional, behavioral, or physical health, issue that is latent, but then through homelessness becomes exacerbated and becomes like a real problem.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that if you can, again, keep them from crossing that line, and whatever that thing is that's buried becomes a problem. If you can keep it down there and keep them like normal functioning members of society.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, there's the like moral and ethical component to this. If we just want to take care of our neighbors.
Yeah.
But just for like pure economics, it's a lot better for the taxpayer to do it this way too.
Yeah, there was a great story about 10 years ago now called $1 Million Murray. And it's way outdated now, but it was literally a story of Murray, who was a homeless person, and what he cost the society for being homeless over a course of a year, or I think it was his lifetime as a homeless person. But when you think about how many times he was arrested, how many times there was a EMS call because he was in some sort of arrest, cardiac arrest or otherwise, and he was in the hospital, he paid for hospital time, jail time, social service time, all of that public service to pay for him to stay on the street.
Adds up.
What that cost was, and how much cheaper it would have been at the beginning of that cycle, whatever time that was, to get him housed.
To just take care of him.
Yeah. And I'm sure $1 Million Murray is now a $3 million Murray. But you can imagine how much better it would be to keep somebody from being on the street and keep them housed, and how much better that would be for them and, frankly, for society.
So in your time at the Housing Authority so far, you're getting to know a lot of new people, both inside the building in terms of your staff, and outside of the building, new partnerships, or maybe people you had pre-existing relationships with that you're developing a partnership with in this capacity. What has your experience been over the last 15 months or so, working with your staff and developing new partnerships across the community?
It's funny.
And what's your strategy on this, by the way, too?
Yeah, it's funny. We're in the process right now of recruiting for some project managers for our development team, and we had interviews yesterday and second interviews today. And what I always think about when I'm interviewing somebody for a job with the Housing Authority is, number one, do they have some alignment with our mission? Is it just a job for them, or do they really care about the mission? Because to me, that's most important. We can teach the technical skills, but they have to really be aligned to our mission. And I think that, to me, is the most important part of building a team. We have had some turnover, and we've grown the agency since I've been there. We hired somebody for one of our social workers or case managers. Her name is Mari, and she started working with us about 3 months ago. She lived in housing when she was a 9-year-old girl. She moved into our housing when she was 9 with her mother and 2 siblings. Wow. Her mother still lives with us, but she and her 2 siblings have sort of launched out of public housing, launched out of subsidized housing. Yeah, and she's in her mid-30s, and she was so moved by the experience of the Housing Authority of helping her sort of set her path forward. She wanted to come back and work for us, and now she does. And so when she's talking to our residents,
she's invested.
She's totally invested in the mission, and she cares about what she does. And when she's talking to families, she can inspire them with her own story. And I think that's really powerful. And so I'm always looking for that with our staff, because this is hard work. It's complicated. Sometimes we don't always get what we want. Sometimes the stories are really heart-wrenching. And if you don't believe in what you're doing at the Housing Authority, it makes it really hard to work here. You're not going to last. And so, I mean, we have people that have worked for us for over 30 years. And they were here during the old days when we were an old-fashioned public housing agency. And, we've evolved a lot since then, and you can see that transition. But they've seen us go from a small agency to really making an impact in the city. And so for me, it's all about the people that we bring on and creating a culture where we don't do this alone. Like I say this a lot, our development team has been really successful in developing new projects, but those projects don't get built without our property managers and our Section 8 team, because it's a whole puzzle that puts that together. And when they finish a project, they hand it over to the property management team. That has to be a smooth handover. And if the property management team is involved in the project development, they know what they're getting by the time it gets handed over to them to manage. And that's a really important part of sort of the culture we're trying to grow at the Housing Authority.
Well, let's talk a little bit, Jeff, about what types of residents you're serving.
Okay.
I've had Linda Braunschweiger on this program, and we've talked about how there's some misconceptions, right? Like in the community about affordable housing, who lives there, how it works, how it's funded, how it's built. I would say even in the housing space, I'm not sure there's a lot of people that understand the nuances of how all this works.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about who you're serving. What types of residents, what type of Ventura resident do y'all serve?
Yeah. Well, as I said, we have about 1,100 units. I think probably half of them, a little over half, are seniors or disabled or both. And so those folks are in housing, stabilized, with limited income. They pay their share of their income towards rent. We pay the rest through the financing of the project.
Is it about 30% that they pay? Or?
It's usually about 30%.
Okay,
it could be as high as 40, but it's typically around 30%.
Okay.
And they end up having a really good quality of life. And so we try to build community in these places where we bring in sort of community services and case managers, and we try to engage them so that they really feel like they live in a community and not by themselves. We have a lot of people in that group that have no family. Their family has become the housing authority and their neighbors. And so that's a significant part of our population. They're not going to evolve out of subsidized housing. They're retired, they're on fixed income. That's not going to change. So our job is to give them a quality of life that they can enjoy
and keep
for
them
the rest of their life.
And keep them off the street.
Yeah, and keep them there. Exactly. And that's really important. The balance, which is a big number, are young families with young growing kids. In Westview alone, which is our redevelopment area on the west side, which went from 180 units of public housing built in the early 50s, it will be 320 units of brand new housing by the time we're done.
It's a beautiful complex, by the way.
Thank you. We're very proud of it, and it's largely families, and these are families that have 2 and 3 and 5 kids. We have over 400 kids living on that property.
Wow.
And so that's a population that we want to help the families continue to evolve. So maybe they as a family don't need subsidized housing anymore because they've grown up in their maybe they got the education or the job change. But we also want to make sure if the parents never leave the housing that we provide, that maybe the kids do. And I mentioned Mari, one of our own employees now, but there's a family in Westview that has 5 kids, 2 parents, so seven-person household in a 3-bedroom apartment. They moved into Westview when these kids were young. Now, 2 of them have graduated, and one's a nurse and one's in the Navy. The third one's a high school senior who I've talked to. She is going places, and her younger 2 siblings are just as doing just as well in school as the older 3. I don't think any of those 5 kids will be in subsidized housing when they grow up.
It's such a great story.
And their parents are strawberry pickers. So these parents made the decision to live in our housing. They were lucky enough to get assigned our housing. And they've made it very clear that and I don't know them, I haven't talked to the parents, but you can just tell by the family that those parents decided stabilized housing, our kids are going to grow up to no longer need it. And that's a huge, powerful story that I think we're really proud of. There's a lot of families like that live in our.
Well, I mean, in terms of, we talk about they pay their 30%, the rest is subsidized, and
Yes.
necessarily that's subsidized with like taxpayer dollars, tax credits, those sorts of things. But as far as I can tell, that is an investment on the part of the taxpayers in these people and in their future prosperity.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a couple of programs that HUD funds called self-sufficiency programs. The FSS, Family Self-Sufficiency Program, is my favorite because if you sign up for that, and it's a 5-year commitment, you set goals for education, job growth, whatever those goals are, we help you get there with teaching you how to have a checkbook, how to save, how to put money aside. As your income increases, you pay the increased rent, but the increased rent we don't keep it, we put it in an escrow account.
Wow.
And when you graduate from that program, that's your money. We give it back to you. You can use it any way you want. And people graduate with 15, 20, 30. It's been as high as close to $100,000 in some cases. It's probably averages in the $30,000 range, but that's
not
chunk
chump
of money.
change. That's not chump change.
And these families would have no way of doing that without that. And so that might mean that they use it for education. Maybe they find a way to partner with like the Ventura County Community Development Corporation with other down payment assistance, and they can buy a home. There have been that have done that. Or frankly, they might just buy a really reliable car that allows them to get to a really good job that they couldn't otherwise get to. So those kinds of things are happening. Yes, it's true that there are families that pass down their subsidy from generation to generation. That's true. I can't say that's not true. But our goal is to get more families to break that pattern and give them the services and the support to help them do that.
So in terms of your goals for your organization, we're always going to talk about like short-term, medium, long-term goals.
Yeah.
What types of short-term and long-term, medium-term goals do you have for the Housing Authority? I know you and I talked before recording this about the work you're doing on the Valentine Road project and some work you're doing with school districts.
Yeah.
What else can you tell us?
Yeah, I'll start with Valentine Road for sure. I mean, that's a project that we will be done the renovations by the end of 2025. We've now moved in 27 people in an interim condition in a hotel building that hasn't been renovated, but we're under construction on 64 units. Those will be done by the spring, and then we'll do the balance over the summer and fall. That's all hands on deck because it's county services, it's referrals from the continuum of care and the Human Services Agency, whole person care, bringing people into that building, creating the environment where they can be safe and thrive. And so that's a huge effort. We have 9 staff assigned to that building. They're not all here yet because we're still evolving, but we have dedicated 9 staff just to that building.
Wow.
Four property managers, 4 case managers, and 1 maintenance person. So it's a big deal for the agency. It's going to add employees and we've also put a lot of energy in trying to address homelessness with that project. So that's really a big deal for us. And we couldn't do it with a ton of partners. The county and the city have been amazing partners, not just providing funding, but being really part of the strategy team. I was just talking to the COC yesterday about how do we make sure that we continue the success that we've had with the first 27 people throughout the whole renovation of that building. So that's a big part of it. We are definitely interested in school district property. That school district has its own process for how they dispose of property. We've made it very clear we have strong interest in 1 or 2 of those sites. We think that's a unique opportunity in Ventura because these are sites that are well located for affordable housing. And we all know the school district is challenged with reduced enrollment because families can't afford to live in Ventura and even teachers can't afford to live here. So if we can convert some school sites that are not being used for anything else to housing for teachers, employees of the school district, and young families.
So would it be, are you talking about like direct workforce housing, like earmarked for educators, or would it be affordable housing that's near where they work that they have access to?
It could be either or. I mean, there's laws in California now that allow school districts to convert for housing and have it be dedicated to school district employees. The school district has to maintain some level of ownership of the property. It could be in a partnership or a long-term lease. And the school district is right now kind of assessing what its need is based on its employees, how many units, of what level of affordability, of what unit size. That's going to drive how much of that we need. With 5 or 6 sites available for disposition, they probably don't all need to be for school district employees, but others could be for others.
The workforce housing, whether it's for like teachers or whoever, like makes me very nervous. I mean, we did this in the like 40s and 50s with the coal mines in like Virginia, right?
Right.
And it's a terrible, terrible day when somebody loses their job and their housing on the same day.
Correct. Yep. Well, and we've even talked to teachers that say, I'm not sure I want to live with my fellow teachers.
Right. So, I just spent 8 hours around you people. Like,
right.
Yeah.
So we'll go through that process. And it might be that we do a mixed project that has some teacher dedicated units and some that are open to the general public of whatever affordability. I'm particularly interested. I'm not been secret about this. I love the Washington School in Midtown. So I have my eye on that, but I know the school district has their process and we honor that. And hopefully at some point there'll be an RFP that we can participate in to make that happen. I think because those are sites that are really well located. And so I think that's a great place for us to be. We're always looking for new opportunities. And so for me, the maybe midterm or longer term is to sort of reintroduce the Housing Authority to the community. Because I don't think, in my experience since I've been here, people don't know who we are.
How do you do that?
this is a good way of doing that. So thank you very much, Rob, for this. I think it just getting the word out that who we are, what we do, because people have this image of what a housing authority is, and we're not that anymore. And
right.
so
No, they think like the projects from like Charles Bronson movies.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's and people still refer to Westview as the projects because it was the projects for 50 years. It's close to 75 years. And actually, I have staff that are now kind of thinking, let's not shy away from calling it the projects. Let's just own it.
Just embrace it.
Let's just embrace it, because why not? That's what people call it anyway. And why does the projects have to be a bad thing? It could be a good thing. And so we're kind of
you got to like redefine the word.
Yeah, and we call it Westview Village, and it really is a village. It's been designed to have the core of the common services right in the middle. And we just had our daycare. We have 2 childcare facilities in that building, in that complex, that opened today. First day they're serving kids in Ventura is today. So 2 classrooms, one for very young kids and one for slightly older kids, all under 4 or 4 and under. And they're operating today with a priority for our families, but other families on the west side. And I also think we're trying to figure out a way to play a role in the west side. We have a pretty good footprint there, and we don't just have to worry about our real estate. We can play a bigger role. And one example is we're doing street improvements right now. We got a grant that was part of the Westview 2 funding, Westview 3 funding, that allowed us to do offsite improvements. And so we're going to do crosswalks and sidewalks and wider sidewalks to make it a safe place to walk in the west side. I think that's going to be a huge improvement. Right now, if you go down Barnett, we've dug up one whole side of Barnett from Olive to the Avenue, but that's going to make that a very positive walking experience and a safe walking experience for the Avenue. Cool. So I think we're trying to figure out how to play a role beyond the real estate.
Housing touches everything, and everything touches housing.
It does, yeah. And so that we're a citizen of the community, and we want to play that role, and that's important to us.
One of the complaints that I've heard, and I'm sure you've heard it too, is that whether you are a landlord wanting to participate with the housing authority, or whether you are a renter looking for a place to live, the paperwork sucks. Either way, it's a mountain, and it's a real challenge. Yep. I would argue, and I think you would too, it's to some degree an inhibitor of success. How do you streamline and reimagine that process? And of course, still be compliant with state and federal rules. Yep. But there's got to be a way to like simplify this, right?
Totally. And we are one of the things we put in this year's budget, and we're shifting from October 1st to September 30th to a calendar year budget, is money to basically to scan all the documentation in our Section 8 office. So all the voucher staff have drawers and drawers of documentation, and they often have to refer back to them. And so having that paper handy is really important. But we're going to scan it all, and we're going to go on a go-forward basis. Everything's going to be electronic.
What's your timeline on that?
We will have that done by the end of 2025. I wish it was sooner. It might be sooner.
I'll check with you in 13 months.
Please do. Yeah. Please do, because I know we can do better. And I've talked to realtors who say I can make a transaction of a $3 million home transition on my phone with DocuSign, and I can't do that to rent a unit to the housing authority. So I take that seriously, and we are working to try to automate the system and make it as easy as possible. Because what we want to do is, because landlords can't not allow a Section 8 applicant to apply. Right. I mean, they can't do that legally. But if we put a roadblock to a Section 8 applicant, so it takes longer or it's more uncertain than a non-Section 8 applicant, we've sort of given an opportunity for them to go with a non-Section 8 voucher holder. And we want the Section 8 voucher holder to have the best chance to get into a unit as possible. And we don't want to be the roadblock to make that happen.
You know, one of the things also along those same lines that you and I talked about, before we recorded this, was the sort of disparity between the amount of vouchers that are available and the amount of properties and like the funding behind these. Can you walk our audience through a little bit how the Section 8 program works, both in theory and in application? Yeah,
and it's very complicated. Anything that with the HUD is, unfortunately. But I think the thing that's important to understand is we get 2 things. We get a allocation of vouchers from the federal government, and sometimes there's specific types of vouchers, whether they're VASH vouchers for veterans or regular vouchers. But we get a voucher allocation. that voucher allocation allows us to subsidize that voucher holder's unit and pay roughly 70% of the rent directly to the landlord. That costs money for that subsidy. So, but we don't get the amount of subsidy we need to cover the amount of vouchers we have. So
is that a product of how expensive it is in Ventura?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It's sort of a standard amount across the country, and it doesn't really adjust for more expensive markets. So we don't get enough of our housing assistance funds to cover all the vouchers we have. So we can't use all of our vouchers, not because we don't feel like it or we're too lazy or the process is bureaucratic. It's because we don't have enough money to pay the subsidy. And in fact, right now we've been in what's called a shortfall, which means we've now run out of subsidy money, and we can't issue any new vouchers until that subsidy money adjustment happens. And unfortunately, last year HUD, when they gave us our annual allocation, they didn't give us an inflation factor. They gave us a zero factor.
We
can't explain that.
You may not
either.
know the answer to this, but why is there not some sort of like indexing to this for cost of living? I mean, because dude, it doesn't take as much to like provide these vouchers in like Lubbock, Texas, as it does in Ventura, California.
Yeah.
So they probably have maybe a little more than they need, and we're short. Why is there not some sort of adjustment?
I've asked that question since I've been here, and we've asked for many years. It's just something that hasn't been addressed in Washington yet, and so it's just a nature of you get what you get, and you make the best of it as you can, and that's where we've been. We would love to get more money to make sure all of our vouchers are on the street, because that would house that many more people. That's why our wait list is 8,000 people long, because if you want to get on the Section 8 voucher list today, we're probably talking like 10 years to 12 years sometimes before we can actually give you a voucher, and that's a really long time. And lives change a lot.
Oh yeah, no, like by the time somebody comes up on the list, very, very often they don't need the help for any number of reasons. They don't need it anymore.
They might have moved out. They might have decided to move in with family. They might have passed away.
Moved to a different state.
Or maybe they've no longer need the subsidy, but all of those things happen. And so the list gets purged every year because people's circumstances change and they no longer are eligible, but it doesn't get purged enough to make a big difference.
So when you say it gets purged every year, does that mean people have to reapply every year?
No, we send a letter to everybody on the list once a year and say, confirm to us that you're back on. So one of the things we say to people all the time is if you move, you have to tell us you moved, because we will send you a letter asking you to confirm you still want to be on the list. And if we don't have your new address and it didn't get forwarded because you moved a year ago or 9 months ago, then we're going to assume you're off the list.
It's just a non-response.
It's non-response means we take you off the list. So it's really important that if you're on the list, it's okay to stay vigilant. Call us. Call us once a month if you want to. We have a whole bunch of housing specialists. That's their job.
To get on the list or like reapply for the list, is that like a paper form or is that an online thing?
It's an online thing.
Okay. Well, that's kind of helpful.
So that's one thing we do. Yeah.
Jeff, we have housing issues across California.
Yeah.
Okay. And they're better or worse in some parts than others, but across California, it's a problem.
Yeah.
But it's not even just California anymore, right? Like, across the country.
Yeah.
In historically low cost of living places like Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Florida, like these, and I don't mean like the pretty parts of Florida. I mean like, like everywhere, right? Like, what are some unique challenges though that we face in Ventura County?
We have pressures here, and one of the things I have to remind people all the time is if you think about downtown Ventura and as a center of the city, and you draw a circle around it, half of it's the ocean. So you don't have to do a lot of housing in the ocean, right?
Nope.
And then the other, it isn't long before you get into the hillsides or the ag area that's all protected, and so there's a lot less land available, and so particularly in Ventura City, it's all about infill. And the city made that clear in the 2004 general plan. It will continue in the updated general plan that the only way we're going to grow is by filling in the gaps and frankly going up. And there's a big controversy in the city of what up means.
People are deathly allergic in Ventura to going up.
They are, but we have to. If we want to
go out,
we can't go out. Yeah, we could pursue the conversion of ag land and go for a vote of the people, but that's not going to happen. The city's had two. It is, and very uncertain. And no developer is going to want to do that because you have to go a long way into the process and spend a lot of money to get to the point where you have a vote.
Right.
And the last time that happened, it was East Area 1 in Santa Paula, and Lehman area did it. But they also are a pretty significant player in in Santa Paula, and they had the sort of the staying power to kind of go through that process. Most developers aren't going to do that. So we don't really have that as an option.
Well, and
I'm okay with that as long as we have the alternative of infill to balance what we're not doing.
Well,
there.
and part of the Santa Paula thing too was when the initial, my understanding is, correct me if I'm wrong, when the initial SOAR boundary in Santa Paula was drawn, it was drawn a little bit more in than it had to be. So when they wanted to go out a little bit, it was a little bit easier in Santa Paula to do that than in other parts of the county where the SOAR boundary was like literally like at the edge of the growth curve.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Ventura doesn't. They don't have any ag land that's really not dedicated for SOAR. Other cities, because we were first, other cities learned from that and kind of built some wiggle room in there, but Ventura doesn't have that option.
Right.
Yeah. So it's definitely part of the challenge. I think there's been some really good examples at infill at San Juan and Thompson. You might, whether or not you love the architecture, I think the scale works there. There's another building just down the street on Thompson at McMillan. I think there's some good stuff there. I would argue that the stuff by the high school is the right scale. It's not necessarily the best architecture, but it's the right scale. I think what we're doing at Westview, going from 180 units to 320, we're actually adding more open space than we had before and way more community amenities and doubling the amount of units. That's possible, and those kind of amenities, and that's why the
But that's like very deliberate land use.
Yes.
Very deliberate.
Yes. Yeah. And, I live in Midtown, and we're getting a new little grocery store. There's 3 new restaurants happening on Main Street coming in the next couple of weeks. So it's that supports that kind of growth.
Well, I think coastal California in general is like a very desirable place to live.
Yeah.
And so it's necessarily going to be expensive. But we have a situation, in Ventura and in Ventura County where we have so many people that work in agriculture or service-based jobs that they're just not making much money.
Right. And
I was at a city of Ventura City Council subcommittee meeting yesterday where I knew that farm workers, for example, didn't make a lot of money, but I didn't realize, dude, it's like $24,000 a year, which even in Texas is like nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you have, I think it was like around 50% of farm worker families living in single family homes with 2 or 3 or more other families. So how do we, which do you think is a more realistic path? Are we going to lower the cost of housing, or are we going to create jobs that pay people better wages?
Oh, that's an easy question. We have to do both.
Okay.
I think we have to find a way to increase, economic vitality of our community, and that means giving opportunity for, wage increases. But we also have to find opportunities to grow more affordable housing. And I believe. I'm a fan of the inclusionary because it to some degree, I wouldn't say I'm a big fan, but I'm a fan of it because it does create an opportunity. One of the things that I struggle with is with those units, when they're 2 and 3 here or 5 here within a market rate project, those residents are paying rent every month and there's no services for them. If they live in one of our properties, we have services that we can provide to them. They have a community to work through. If they're living in kind of disparately across the city, I think they're not getting the opportunity to have the services to help them leave the low income status. And so that's one of the challenges of those types of units. It's one way of adding to the pie. But I believe we need to do more affordable housing projects that are 100% affordable, and responsible developers like ourselves, but people self-help, many mansions. There's plenty of other developers. We can't do it all. We can't the city's housing numbers are something like 5,000, and I would love to do a lot of those, but we can't do them all, and we're happy to partner with the others.
There's not the land to do it. There's not the money to do it. There's not the labor to do it. So it does have to be multiple organizations.
Right.
Churning full speed ahead on this. Yeah. But you bring up an interesting point, right? Like we want to create more create better paying jobs in Ventura that pay like head of household type wages to people. But that's like a long-term goal. In the short term, we still got to find a place for these folks to live.
Yeah.
And to your point, that probably means building a lot more affordable housing than we have. And, I'll say to our audience, rewind back to when we had Linda Braunschweiger on a few episodes ago and the lasagna funding video. It is very, very difficult to fund these projects.
Yeah.
You try to get your money from the state government, you try to get your money from the federal government. We're just talking about just like cash, and then your local government, your municipal and county governments, and then you have like your tax credits. But then, increasingly in California, you'll be putting a project together and you have this piece of funding in place, from the state. And with our like wildly erratic revenues, maybe that piece of funding like falls apart. The state calls you back and says, just kidding, we can't give you that money. Now, best case scenario, you got to replace that individual piece of funding to move the project forward. Worst case scenario, though, the project was dependent on that specific piece of funding and it just completely falls apart.
Yeah.
Again, I've only been here in California 18 months, but I've heard a lot about, what do they call it? Like the redevelopment, what was it called?
Redevelopment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which went away, like 10 years ago or so?
Yeah, just about. Yeah. Yeah.
Please educate our audience on redevelopment and what it was, why it went away, and kind of segue that into the affordable housing bond proposal that unfortunately went down in flames last year, but that doesn't mean the need went away.
No, absolutely not. I mean, look, redevelopment was a very robust tool that cities could use across California. The basic premise is cities decide an area is blighted. And that blight definition is hard to figure out. You have to really do a lot of analysis to show it. And once you determine an area is blighted, that allows you to form a redevelopment area around that blighted area. That basically freezes the property tax at that level. As investment happens, property tax goes up on individual properties. The redevelopment agency gets to capture that new property tax. They call it the increment, the new increment of property tax created by the investment in that property, and then reinvest that. So the redevelopment agency can use that money to buy property, to help reduce the cost for development, and other things to incentivize development. And that's sort of what redevelopment's all about. It also requires, one of the requirements of redevelopment is 20% of that increment has to go towards affordable housing.
Okay.
And so that was a significant pot of money that cities use all over the state. And redevelopment was a really great tool. Was it perfect? No. Did some cities abuse it by maybe designating an area for blight that really wasn't blighted? Yes. And the other part of it is redevelopment. The redevelopment agent got to keep the increment, but the loser in that was the school district, the county, who would have otherwise got that increased revenue from increased rent, who didn't get it now that it was all going to the redevelopment agency. So there was a lot of pressure and schools needed funding, counties needed funding, and there was enough abuse of redevelopment, enough examples, maybe all anecdotal examples, but enough examples around the state that it got some momentum to eliminate redevelopment. And once it's gone, it's gone. There's a lot of talk about bringing it back.
The state didn't replace it with anything.
No. And there's been conversation about replacing it for years. I don't see how, because the only way to replace redevelopment in any way like it was before is to take from somebody else. And it means take from the school district or take from a county. And I just don't see those agencies in a position to say, yeah, I don't need any more money.
They got tight margins themselves.
Right. So I don't think, now that it's gone, I don't see it ever coming back. And so that's a source of revenue for housing that's gone. And there's no place.
So that's why some folks here in Ventura County were looking at a bond for affordable housing. And, as we said, it didn't end up moving forward and being placed on the ballot, but that doesn't mean the need went away. No. So here in Ventura, the city of Ventura or in Ventura County, what, prospects do you see for a consistent, sustainable, reliable source of affordable housing funding?
I mean, I think at some point, I think in seeing the results of the survey where it wasn't enough to put it on the ballot. And I think that
people
was right.
recognize that we have a housing shortage, a housing affordability crisis. People recognize that in Ventura County, but their position by and large was, I don't have another dime to give, man. Like I am taxed enough already. Yeah,
and I think you're right. I do think it was. I was. There's a little bit of silver lining that people actually
They see the
saw
need.
it as a high need.
They do see the need.
But they just weren't in a and I think I don't have another dime to spend, or I don't trust government to use my money to make it happen. I think both of those were there, and that's unfortunate. But so we have to spend some time building some trust, and I think we can do that. I will say that, like in the city of Ventura, the city council just a month ago, they were doing it on a case-by-case basis, but they just adopted a regulation that allows the city to defer impact fees on affordable housing projects. That's a big deal to us. That's huge. That's a huge deal for us. We were doing it on a case-by-case basis, and the council was generous in approving it, but we couldn't rely on it. Now we know we can count on the city's deferral of impact fees, which are hundreds of thousands of dollars for us. And that's a local match. That when we count that as a local match when we go for federal or state money, and it gives us more points to say the city believes in us. They're deferring our fees at a tune of, let's just say, $300,000 or $400,000.
So when you defer them, does that? I want to make sure we all understand this. We're on the same page. That means the developer, instead of paying them up front, they pay them maybe when the certificate of occupancy is issued.
No, later. It's at least 3 years. The way the city regulations, I think it's at least 3 years deferred. And then it's paid back based on cash flow. Oh, wow. And if cash flow is not there, it doesn't get paid until the project has enough positive cash flow.
Because you don't want it going under.
Right.
Right.
And so it's our job to, and there's a lot of things that come out of that positive cash flow that has to be paid for out of a project. But and projects usually take 3 to 5 years to settle. And then it's not guaranteed there'll be positive cash flow in year 5. But as there is, then that money starts getting paid back to the city as it gets paid to other folks that we owe the money to based on how the funding happens. So it is a really valuable thing for us, and that we book it as a loan, and because it does help us with our point score when we go get federal and state money. Wow. It makes a huge difference, and that's now in the city as they do inclusionary, as developers opt out of providing the units and paying the fee.
The in lieu fee. That fee can create a fund that the city can then use to leverage as well. And if the city ends up building some money into that inclusionary fee fund, they can say, let's just say they have $1 million in there. They can make a loan of $500,000 to a project, which could help that project leverage $5 million in state money. So that fee could be valuable down the road as well. Well, or they could buy $1.5 million of art like the city of Oxnard did.
Yeah, well, yeah. Yes.
Go either way.
Could either way.
Go either way.
Yeah.
Let's wrap up with this.
Yeah.
To solve our housing challenges in Ventura County, I think we're going to have to be very creative and innovative because of the restrictions that we have, whether it's SOAR, things from Sacramento, unfunded mandates that way. But I do think we're going to need all of the above type of approach.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that means affordable single family and multifamily. That means market rate, single family and multifamily, starter, mid, executive housing.
Yeah.
All of the above.
All of it.
Having been in the space as long as you have, how do we sort of build the relationships between the affordable housing folks and the market rate housing folks to solve this in a more collaborative way? And how do we determine what the right balance of types of housing is? Because when we do our general plan or our housing element, we are hyper-focused on those RHNA numbers, which deals with affordable housing, but we don't really have any discussions about, hey, if we want to create better paying jobs and we want companies to found, relocate, or expand in Ventura, we need executive housing. That's not part of the plan at all. That's not ever part of the discussion. How do we evaluate and get to the right balance?
Well, I mean,
and of course, it's like hitting a moving target.
Oh, totally. And the housing element does, though, talk about all levels of affordability, including market rate. There are targets for market rate units as well. Cities often do very well on that end of the spectrum and very badly on the very low income. That's just the nature of it. So there is sort of thought across the whole spectrum. But But it really comes down to who we want to be as a community, and I think for me having sort of the Association of Realtors and the Chamber of Commerce is involved in this conversation is really critical, because the chambers are representing businesses that are trying to grow or maybe be attracted here. What is it going to take for them to grow? And I'm a big believer that we focus on the businesses that we already have. What is it going to take you to grow? What barriers do we need to remove? Because if we can make it good for you that's already here, you're our best cheerleader to anybody we're trying to attract. Because any business thinking about coming to Ventura is going to call other businesses and say, what kind of a friendly environment is it in? So I think that's really critical, but they have to be at the table to have that conversation of what their needs are. I think the realtors are a key component. I mean, I remember when I was in Santa Clarita, and this is maybe an odd example, but when I was in Santa Clarita, one of our communication strategies was to use the hairdressers.
Okay.
Because they talk to everybody.
They're a little gossipy.
And they're gossipy, and they have somebody's undivided attention for a period of time. And so if you could inform them what was happening at the city, and they could just, by the nature of those conversations, spread the word, that was really powerful. I think in today's world, the realtors are that group. Because the realtors have fingers everywhere, and their job is to know their community. And so, how do we engage?
We're very invested in the quality of life in our communities.
Absolutely, it frankly helps home prices. It helps attract buyers when they have a community they want to live in and invest in, and they want to feel like they're investing in a community that's going to stay high quality, evergreen community for longer. So I think that's a voice that's really important. And I think just the fact that you're talking to Linda and to me means that those connections are already happening. And to me, that's the sort of the secret sauce, is to have the right people in the room talking to each other. Well,
communication's everything. Relationships are everything.
Totally.
And we've established an affordable housing work group at the Association of Realtors, and I feel very, very blessed that we have smart guys like Rick Schroeder from Many Mansions.
Sure.
I don't know that I can find anyone that knows more about affordable housing than Rick.
He's the guy.
So we are trying to educate our members more on how this stuff works. I mean, because for too long, I think we've seen affordable housing over here and the market rate over here, when really it's like a continuum.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And they're all cogs in the same machine.
Yeah.
And so I think if we're going to solve these problems, we need to be doing it in a more collaborative way. And so we're trying to have those conversations and better understand all sides of the equation.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to approach it. Yep.
So, well, with that, I'm going to give you the last word. Any words for residents of Ventura?
Yeah, I think to know that the Housing Authority is your partner. I mean, we are here to expand the capacity of affordable housing, but not just the housing itself. It's really the first step for us. It's the sort of quality of life and providing community services. And we don't do that alone. We have 30 to 40 partners that help us provide value to our residents. This afternoon, we're kicking off our holiday barbecue. We have one at all of our properties. We have great partners that come in and serve.
What time is that? I'll be there.
3:30, so you might not make
shortly.
It. Yeah. It's for us, it's a really great way to reconnect with our residents. And I often have coffees with it's just called Coffee with the CEO. I know, very creative name. But I know our residents feel really valued when I or somebody from the executive team shows up on their property. They know their property manager, they might love them, but when somebody from what we call the mothership shows up, it just means that we care about them as human beings. And our residents, particularly our elderly and disabled, are often alone. They often don't have family. And so we have to remember that. And then our other families are struggling just to get by their day. So to get them out to something is not easy to do.
That's how you build community. That's how you build trust.
Exactly. And that's what we're about, is we're building community every step of the way. And I think that's important. And that is for our communities and for our residents, but it's for how we fit into the larger Ventura picture.
Well, you're doing a hell of a job. We're all very pleased and very proud to have you on board. And we did not get through the entire agenda today, so we're going to have to have you back for round 2.
Okay.
But in the meantime, thank you for coming. Thank you, audience, for joining us again on this edition of the Legislative Lens. Remember to like and subscribe if you like what we're doing here. And if you don't like what we're doing, please like and subscribe anyway, because we could use the numbers. Until next time, Rob Leatherwood, Jeff Lambert, thanks for coming.